Welcome to this episode of Season 4 of The Common Bridge, where policy and current events are discussed in a fiercely nonpartisan manner. The host, Richard Helppie, is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and political analyst who has reached over 3.5 million listeners, viewers, and readers around the world. The Common Bridge is available on the Substack website and the Substack app. Just search for The Common Bridge. You can find the program on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. The Common Bridge draws guests and audiences from across the political spectrum, and we invite you to become a free or paid subscriber on your favorite medium.
And welcome to The Common Bridge. I'm Brian Kruger. I'm the producer of this show, and I'm also the guy that happens to read all of Rich's viewer mail. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is just going to be a run through of comments he gets online. He gets a lot of those. And folks that take the time to write into Substack, we find those to be the most interesting, and ask Rich questions. And we're just going to start right out of the bag doing that. Rich, welcome to your own Common Bridge. And are you ready to do this today?
We're going to find out. We're both going to find out together. So.
All right, let's just jump into this. So I've got a writer, or a reader. Actually, he's a reader and a listener,
Okay.
Mike Horn. And he says, Rich, love the show. While I know this isn't necessarily policy solutions, I'd like to hear your take on New York Congressman George Santos.
Oh, geez, right off the bat. Well, George Santos. Okay. So what people would be expecting me to say is something like, well, gosh, look at Elizabeth Warren's claim to be Native American. Look at Joe Biden's claim to have graduated top of his class and have gone on a full academic ride, or that Adam Schiff actually has a whistleblower or oodles of Russian information, etc. But I don't think that's really germane. It just gets back into the right, left, red, blue, etc.
Yeah.
I think this is just something, Donald Trump, okay, is another guy people would expect me to say, well, of course, Trump paved the way. And of course, Trump seemed to say whatever popped into his head at that moment, with really no strategy to it, and in fact, to his own detriment. But I really think it points to what we talk about on the Common Bridge. Both political parties are absolutely dysfunctional. They're not doing the job they're supposed to do, i.e. representing us. And the media, the newspapers or former newspapers now online, the digital news programs, et cetera, aren't doing what they're supposed to do about ferreting out facts and truth. And George Santos is just the result of decades, or probably hundreds of years, of politicians making stuff up, and then coupled with this dysfunction. And what do I mean by the dysfunction? The Republican Party obviously didn't vet the guy, okay, before they made him the candidate. The media reporting in New York never went in. And for Pete's sake, where is the opposition research that the Democrats should have on this guy? All three of them absolutely misfired. And now that he's there in Washington, people are going, well, he's kind of not the first guy entering this pristine truth-telling environment. So
what do you think? What do you think the impact of local? Because this is a small town he's from, and I understand that the local newspaper there actually wrote something that questioned some of his qualifications, but there weren't any larger regional newspapers that used to have those journalists around to ask those questions. What do you think? What kind of impact do you think that has, that newspapers seem to be disappearing all over the country and local journalism for local newsrooms?
yeah, well, there is a vacuum there, clearly, that the old media model is dying. This is just one more symptom of it. How do you pay for that? There are some really good hyper local reporting systems and hyper local podcasts. As you know, I'm a big fan of Paid the Cost, which is Nativo Gonzalez in Santa Cruz, California, hyper local reporting. I think we need to get more of that. And I don't know, perhaps there'll be a subscription model for those types of businesses, and they'll become more searchable online, because you do really have people on the ground working to get facts out. But yeah, it's a failure. And why wasn't the Democratic op research all over this? And where were the Republicans in vetting them? I mean, there's, you know,
It's amazing.
inexcusable.
Right, especially today with internet viability, information's all out there. It's just staggering that that guy got that far. Anyway, um, Sean Phelan says, "When are you going to have a guest on to talk about transgender rights in schools? I think you're afraid of the topic."
Okay. Uh, I'd love to have someone come on to talk about transgender rights. Um, and again, I think it's a subject that we should bring to the fore. And you're running into the collision of medical information. Again, there are people that are born indeterminate genitalia with chromosomes that are different, with you know sometimes secondary sex characteristics that are both. You have people that reach adulthood and they can do whatever they want to do with their body. Um, but I think it gets down to, what do we do about school age children who are going through adolescence? And again, I think that this hormone therapy and surgeries for people that aren't old enough to order a drink or cast a vote is going to come back to us as a hideous new lobotomy. And the fact that, well, we're not going to allow parents to be involved um, is a little crazy, particularly right now when we have parents that are jailed because of the crimes that their children have committed. So you can't have it both ways. I think we need to get it out onto the fore and have a discussion about what makes sense. And I'd love to have a great guest. Brian, we do invite a lot of people to come onto the show that won't come on. They're very comfortable going into soundbite world affirmation programming, and they don't want to hear the thoughtful question. They don't want to hear the countervailing points of view. And they just won't come on. We've had a number of guests that have agreed to be on the show, and we've presented them. Here's the outline. Here's the things we'd like to talk about. They are framed as questions, and that once they look at the outline, they don't want to be on the show, and that's their prerogative. I don't, they're still playing in that old affirmation programming world. We're not there.
Well, luckily, like I say, we're approaching 200 episodes. This is 193rd, I believe. That hasn't happened too much with you. I think people like getting on your show. We've had a couple, like you say, that have said yes and then said no, or we couldn't get them on because they weren't going to have just a soapbox. It was going to be a discussion. Once they realized that, they weren't on. But that's only been a few, really, over the last couple of
Yeah,
years.
and look, most of the folks that do come on appreciate the wide-ranging discussion. Most of them I don't think are hearing anything that they haven't heard privately before, and they're happy to have the discussion. So some, things that are fairly controversial, like, ranked choice voting is one. What's the nuance behind that, and proportional voting, and what's the nuance behind those types of stories? Um, the law enforcement, what's working, what's not working. So hopefully we'll continue to get guests. Anyone that comes on will be treated respectfully. They'll have opportunity to review things in advance, and we don't do gotcha questions. We're here to inform, not to influence.
Right. So here's one from Jesse Dugan, and I say this, and this one's a little bit of a shot, but I want to give you a shot back at it. But I like this kind of question because it's obviously somebody who listens, reads, or watches often, because their comment is based on that. And Jesse's comment is, how would your gun training and progressive licensing program have worked with the 6-year-old in Virginia who shot his teacher?
Well, the way it would have worked is that there's provisions in the idea for safe storage requirements. So if you want to have a firearm in your house, then you may, with the proviso that you secure it, and that firearm, with today's technology and gun vaults and the like, can be readily available should the need for home protection arise, without it being accessible to a 6-year-old. So had the law been in place, had the law been followed, the tragedy would not have occurred. Although I should probably point out that there are states like California that do have safe storage requirements, and people just don't follow it, which
Cool.
is an issue, obviously.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, thanks for writing that because I know you're still listening because you obviously listen if you knew what his gun training and progressive licensing program was. So this is from Eric Finley, and it's regarding progressive agenda in Chicago, the Matt Rosenberg episode that you had, which got a blast of reactions online. Um, None of them were, a lot of them were supportive of the show. Most of them were, but just a lot of them were disgruntled Chicagoans. Eric Finley writes, why just focus on Chicago? Name me a major U.S. city where this isn't the case. So, Rich, what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe recap what that Rosenberg uh, uh, episode was about and then answer the question if you can.
Okay, well, it'd be difficult to recap that entire episode. Invite people to go back and listen, and
Great job.
also to read Matt Rosenberg's book, which is quite good. Um, he is a real reporter. He knows the city. He walked hundreds of miles. He talked to lots of people. Um, and what he really pointed out was the breakdown of the nuclear family, and particularly people, young men, especially being raised in homes without fathers, no accountability, that the allegiance can be to something outside the home. Tragically, too often that can be a gang, but it's not just gang type members that are involved, it's the public and the innocents around them as things spill over. Um, then, when we talk about what happens when somebody is arrested for doing something and they're not held, they're not punished, they're not held accountable, they're right back out there again. And I think Rosenberg's big point was we pay these taxes. Our education system is horrible. That should be a basic function. Our public safety, which is not something you can privatize, has been absolutely compromised. And we're being told that we, the law abiding citizens just trying to make their way through life, are the problem. Um, and the reason it was about Chicago is because that's what Matt wrote about was Chicago, which he knew. Um, Certainly, someone could write that same story about New York. Um, I've been in Los Angeles recently. Haven't been to San Francisco for several years, basically because they've deteriorated so badly. But the root of it is we're not looking out after taxpayers, homeowners, people trying to educate their kids. Those that can flee. Now,
Would you say, because Eric Finley, I think, is saying your reader and your listener, Eric Finley, I think, is saying that is that not the case in most major cities where the progressive agenda, usually progressive mayors, city councils, and such, are doing the
yeah,
same
right.
thing?
No, Chicago's not necessarily an outlier. And people keep voting folks in that do these things. Now, I will tell you, there's one, and maybe call me a homer or an optimist, but I see a lot of good things happening in Detroit. We
Totally
still
agree.
have issues. We still have too much violence. We still have too many fatherless homes. Um, but there's so many good things that are happening in the city itself, and because people have finally gotten tired of accepting a city that was dysfunctional. And frankly, the bankruptcy really helped. And that was a collaboration of a Republican governor and Rick Snyder and a Democratic mayor in Mike Duggan. And so bonds that were never really going to get paid back were bankrupted. And now that money is, it's gone to, new police cars and street lights and cleaning the streets and so forth. And there's been a lot of investment in the town. Some of the wealthier families have taken on parts of the city to revitalize and refurbish. I mean, look, we got ways to go, but I think things are moving along. I'm
Yeah,
hopeful.
I totally agree on Detroit. Totally agree. John Abel writes, This is regarding James Baker's November the 22nd, the last time Dr. Baker was on in studio. Um, Again, this particular episode garnered over 300 comments within 2 days online, and all of them were about this type of reaction. Anyway, John Abel says you could have stopped at politics. And just to recap, it was Dr. James Baker was talking about, as he often did, he would come back and give us a recap on where COVID was at that time. And this was November 22nd. John Abel writes, you could have stopped at politics. Manufactured, marketed, distributed, and sold as a deadly virus, never amounted to jack squat, smoke and mirrors, misdirection, sheep. It was the flu and pneumonia, Toretto. I looked up Toretto, and I think that's a Van Diesel movie reference of Fast and Furious. Beyond that, I don't know. Nothing changed before, during, or after the Rona except truth and cover up. And then he says MAGA and Trump 2024. The reason I bring this up, Rich, is because you've been a really interesting soundboard for coronavirus since this started, because your show started about the time that this took off. And Dr. James Baker has been a great guest of yours. Would you think that John Abel's comments just now, do you think it really represents an extreme, or do you think that that's where most of the population is? Do they think that this was manipulated in some way?
Well, I think there's suspicions out there, and that I know that the writer is not alone in his thinking. And I remember when the coronavirus was first discovered, and I recall you and I were having a conversation about, well, are we doing too much? And I said, there's just too many unknowns. And we've been trying to get the number of unknowns reduced and try to get the right knowns in there. I can tell you definitively that hospitals and emergency rooms were overwhelmed with COVID patients. We had governors in New York and in Michigan that sent, COVID positive patients back into nursing homes where we had deadly consequences. We did not respond as a good society that's following strong public health reaction. And so to the point about, was the crisis seized for something else? I think that there's probably valid reason to at least be suspicious of that. And I punctuate that by looking at the recent midterm elections and those governors that were most extreme in how they closed the society and shut down schools and so forth, did not run on that. And in fact, our now newly reelected governor in Michigan scoffed and said, what, kids were out of school 3 months? And as if, let them eat cake. They were out of a lot more than that. And so they're not doing themselves any favors. Now, couple that with, we had a president in the White House at the beginning, in Donald Trump, who seemed to think that the daily briefings were a show about him, and proved himself to be a horrible crisis manager, was not a steady hand on the tiller, when he easily could have said, look, we're going to protect the vulnerable. We're going to make sure that every hospital and physician office has all the equipment and supplies they need to deal with sick people. We are going to accelerate trying to find a vaccine or therapeutic. And if people are going to be harmed, economically, we're going to step in and make sure that through no fault of their own, we're going to make sure that they're supported. And the weird thing is the Trump administration did all those things, but all the peripheral stuff and the antics and no focus, people didn't know where to turn. And so where did they turn? They went to social media, and you saw things get divided into the COVID is a hoax. It doesn't really exist. I don't know anybody that got it. It's a mild cold, etc. And to the other side, it's like the coming of the some Stephen King novel or something, and we're going to wash our groceries and the like. And by the way, that divide in who to trust exists today. People talking about who should wear masks, who shouldn't wear masks. And I see it here in Ann Arbor all the time. I see people out walking in the fresh air wearing a mask. Okay. There's no case for doing that. And whether a person chose to be vaccinated or was coerced into being vaccinated or not, that was a decision made at a point in time. And circumstances have changed. What we know has changed. But I still think it speaks to the core problem. It's this thirst for knowledge and real facts, and we don't have a media system delivering that to us. And so I'll end this response by again recommending Dr. Baker's blog. It's called Pandemic Pondering. I don't think Dr. Baker has a political bone in his body. He's eminently qualified. Of course, I'd like you to listen to the 4 or 5 episodes he's been on with us. But look up Pandemic Pondering, Dr. James Baker, University of Michigan Medicine.
Will do. We're going to shift now to, it was a November 9th episode that you had, and it was a commentary that was called "Thank Goodness Campaign Season Ends." And most of the comments on this were funny, and there were like 300 of these too. And everybody just agreeing with you. You got more pats on the back of this one than anything you've ever done. But Lyndon Willingham wrote, what a relief. I went totally to PBS and BBC for news and only checked in locally for weather reports briefly. Mute button got a lot of use the past few weeks. The negative ads were so utterly toxic that I did not want that noise in my house. Turns out PBS and BBC are excellent resources for news. The reason I bring that up to you, and I'd like you to comment on it, is it's kind of an underlying thought that you have, and that is look around different places for your news anyway. And I thought that was interesting. But what do you think about what Lyndon had to say about how she just backed out of U.S. media?
It's not an irrational response. You know what you're going to get when you turn on Fox. You know what you're going to get when you turn on CNN. CNN is trying to make a pivot against tremendous resistance from the base that wanted the affirmation programming. The 5 viewers left at MSNBC know what they're going to get. And so I think getting different sources is important. And I'd recommend a lot of the writers at Substack who actually go out and do reporting. So there's a lot of free stuff there and there's a lot of paid stuff, but more and better information is available other than the stuff that we're getting served up. And if you recall, Brian, when we started this show and people have asked me, well, how do we quit having the politicians polarize us? And how do we quit having the legacy media and the cable media and the former news media quit feeding us this stuff? The answer is real simple. Quit consuming it. They're going to get the idea. You quit buying it, they're not going to do it. They're only doing it because people are buying it. So stop buying it. Tell your friends to quit buying it and go elsewhere.
I know you look at these comments too, but when it gets to be 200 or 300 a day, I know that it gets tough for you. That's why I look at them and try to print them out, and that's why we're doing this. But with Lyndon's comment about watching PBS, which of course is domestic, but BBC, it shows your worldwide influence in your worldwide audience, because there was a whole bunch of people in the UK that piled on the BBC for being conservative, and then it was a mini fight within that particular string that started to get me laughing. I know you appreciate it.
Yeah,
too.
no, I know we have a great following in London. Hello,
Yeah.
Londoners. It's good to be with you here this morning. But so I think it's a healthy discussion. And look, PBS doesn't always get it right. BBC doesn't always get it right. But the media model has been flipped from let's go and discover what the facts are and interview people and look at documents and write that, versus here's the narrative and now let's fill in the blanks. And we're going to have a guest coming on pretty soon. Justin Higgins is coming back. We're going to talk about the stories that are covered in Washington versus, I'm not speaking for the whole Great Lakes or whole rest of the country, but I'm just astonished that the whole Hamilton 68 issue and the fraud, the media fraud that went on, it made Jason Blair look like a piker, is not front page news. And then it occurred to me, well, that was used by every major news outlet. And maybe they just go, well, we don't want to talk about this anymore.
That's going to be a good episode, by the way. I'd look forward to that, and getting Justin Higgins back in is kind of fun. Or you on his show too. That's fun too.
Yes.
Just to wrap up, the thank goodness campaign season ends. Ken Wolf said, "Now for the Medicare and Camp Lejeune lawsuit ads to end."
Yeah, well, we do have Mike Cox scheduled. Mike is a attorney of some renown. He was the Attorney General of the state of Michigan. He's also a former Marine, and he is in the middle of some of those suits, and he's going to come on and inform us about that and what the status of that is. Again, you see the ads, you know something happened. How many people know what the backstory is, and where's the reporting been on that?
I've got a couple of comments from Dr. Nicholas Tito, who was just on recently talking about medical assistance in dying, which is the Canadian MAID Act, and it got a lot of responses, and a lot of them were really heartfelt, and a lot of them were sort of trying to get that way. I got this from Grace Thurman. Y'all are using this to kill disabled people instead of adjusting society to support and accommodate them. Don't even try to lie. I know too many Canadians to have the wool pulled over my eyes, including a disabled individual who had MAID, MAID, that's the medical assistance in dying, recommended to them when they sought an increase in financial support to cover the cost or the rising cost of living in Canada. I thought that was an interesting comment, and obviously from somebody who's in the know. Um, what was your general thought on MAID? I know that there was an alarming part of that um, that I think they're trying to do something about, and that is it's too easy to euthanize somebody in Canada. Um, let me if you can comment on that, or I can read the one from Charles
Yeah,
Murray
yeah.
Chilton.
Let me get the full picture. What we want to talk about here.
Sure. So Charles Murray Chilton says this, and it's in the same vein, but I think this is very interesting. Charles said, "I'm a supporter of one's right to be euthanized. In fact, I would expand the criteria far beyond where they stand now. It's not only about the trillions spent worldwide to keep an empty carbon assembly breathing and with a pulse. It's an interesting thing. But if I don't know my wife, if I can't drink water or eat because I don't know what food or water is, please, for God's sakes, let me have the choice to go."
I think both of these letters are very germane to the subject matter. And I thought the conversation with Dr. Chito was excellent. And I hope people will listen to it because it's very thoughtful. It's not advocacy and it's not opposition at all. It's just this is a very big societal effort. Um, but I would divide it like this: there's a medical need and people with no hope of recovery that might be in agonizing pain, end stage of a disease and not be able to function. And that if they, as Mr. Murray wrote, choose to end their life, they should have the means to do that or assistance if they can't get out of bed to do that. I think that's one category. And then the first writer saying, hey, this is going to be used on disabled people and it's a slippery slope. And that writer would be in agreement with what the indigenous peoples of Canada, or First Peoples as they refer to them, uh, said when this law was being enhanced with even broader eligibility standards. And so if people listen to the episode, we begin by saying, go to the Canadian government's website, canada.ca, go to justice, that's the next level, and then go and look at what they're saying about the MAID, medical assistance in dying law. And the important change come March 17th is that you don't need a medical diagnosis. A mental health diagnosis is all that it takes. So if think about this, Brian, a person is depressed and has suicidal ideation. Today we say, look, we've got to deal with your depression, and we have lots of therapies and medications and ways to deal with that. A It just seems to me to be barbaric to say here's a person with suicidal ideation, and we say, well, great, we'll give you a hand. And so I think we need to understand what this kind of power unleashed can do. And I know that there are people that believe if we go to this next step where there doesn't even have to be a medical condition, and I believe the word they use is irredeemable or irrecoverable, then or irremediable. Maybe that's the word they use.
That's what it was,
That's the word.
irremediable.
Okay, yeah, I knew it was something that was pretty definitive. You weren't coming out of that condition that Mr. Murray writes about. You're a goner, okay, so to speak. And is there a dignified way to end your life? I think there's a moral justification for that with appropriate guardrails on it. The troubling part is, forget about all that. If you just have a mental health diagnosis and then there's a long list of people that can assist you without facing a criminal consequence. And I just think the opportunities for abuse are pretty high. And it is something that we need to keep an eye on, because, the next logical step would be, mandated, perhaps would be mandated termination. So
Yeah, that's a little
yeah, it's very
scary.
scary. I mean, again, nobody knows for sure what's going to happen, and I don't mean to be an alarmist, but people need to understand where the law is today and be thoughtful about whether it's the right one or not, who it'll be applied to, and so forth.
Yeah. Um, so and this one, we're kind of moving along here. This one is about Adam Coleman's "Does Mass Media Lie About Conservatives?" And Marcus Adams wrote, every time the media calls radical right-wing reactionaries, quote unquote, conservatives, they lie about conservatives. The quote unquote conservatives on the Supreme Court are an excellent example of this. It is not conservatives to bring about radical change. I thought that was an interesting comment. Do you have any response is not the right thing because that's just a statement, but anything you want to say about
Well,
that?
I think the writer's got a great point. Is that anything that doesn't fit the agenda of a left leaning publication is by definition conservative, and it's going to be a radical right wing approach. And I hope people listen to Adam Coleman, because he is a very thoughtful and insightful guy. He backs up what he says with his own real world experience. And, one of the things he says that nobody wants to talk about is the correlation between fatherless childhoods and the mass shooters. And, my dearly departed father, okay, he and I, got along on certain levels and didn't on other levels. But I know for sure that I'd have to answer to him as the first line of authority. And I guarantee you that that is something. And we need to teach young men how to be good fathers. We need to teach them how to become good men and to help build great communities. And I think, if that's a conservative principle, great. I would hope it'd be a universal principle. But if that's a conservative principle in today's world, that would be bringing about, radical change to
Mm-hmm.
come out and say it's better to have a father in the house, okay, with the proviso that the father performs as the father versus somebody that's damaging to the spouse or children.
Do you think you'd get pushback today on that from feminism and from feminists?
I think it'd depend on the feminist.
Mm-hmm.
That I think there's another category that people wrap up in one definition. And look, I can tell you in my business career where we had a lot of women, 45% in upper management, and looking back and understanding that, wow, they were often the only woman in the room during big and important meetings. There might be 20 people in there, all guys wearing white shirts and blue suits and power ties and the like. And what a difference experience that must have been for them. I mean, they had the opportunity, but they were clearly in the minority. And I've had many family members also that really were pioneers. That's just in my lifetime. So there's to lump them in then with the a more radical fringe that wants to adopt the term feminism, I don't think is fair. So again, that's one of those labels that we just have to be careful about.
Okay. As we wrap this up, I want to throw in a couple of them because we get these from time to time, and I think they're longtime listeners. Maybe they're friends of the show, maybe they're friends of yours. I don't know, but I like it. Anyway, we hear from Mike Crabtree. Rich, looking forward to your continued success with the Common Bridge in 2023. Um, Rama Gagnon Hogan said, "Congratulations on your fourth season. I'm always learning something each time I tune in." And we have a bunch of those, but we're just patting each other on the back at that point. But I think it's important to to get the positive feedback at that time. So, any closing thoughts from you on uh, having these type of comments come up? And of course, we'd like to see more of them on Substack. But anything you'd like to say, just as a group, as we move on from this?
Well, thank you, Mike and Rama and anyone else. Certainly, um, the encouragement is uplifting. Okay, and I do dearly appreciate it. And so, I guess on a closing comment, Brian, there can't be a show unless there's guests and an audience, and I'm grateful to the guests. I'm grateful for the audience. I'm doing my best to be informative versus influencing, trying to open up dialogue so that we can have discussion. Uh, and thanks to your great work on producing, putting together nice programs for us, it's the discussion, it's the exchange of ideas, it's the delving into subject matter is the only thing that's going to keep us out of a bitter partisan divide and a civil war. We're not going to convince somebody of a particular ideology to adopt an opposite one, but maybe we can find places we agree. Should we have clean drinking water? I think we can agree on that. Can we have safe schools that give our kids an education that'll allow them to have a good life in adulthood? I hope we can agree on that. Can we have streets that are safe? And then another topic, what's our right to privacy? What's our right to, be forgiven and forgotten about, maybe something we did as a younger person? Um, I know Bill Maher talks about this. He has a term called presentism. I think it's his term that, you know, to hold somebody in 2023 to the standards, to hold somebody's behavior in 1968 to the standards of 2023 is a little absurd. All right. Because people are part of the society. Um, so this is what I think we can do. We can inform, we can invite commentary, and I do appreciate these comments. And I hope that we keep getting more and that people will just talk. All right.
All right, great. And with that, we'll wrap this up and get everybody again to comment, but comment on Substack, where we'll have some bonus information out there, and the responses out there will be the same as we really start to focus on our Substack product.
Great. Yeah. And Substack's really designed for writers, and then writers expanding into audio and video. And we're kind of coming the opposite direction. And
Yeah.
so right now, I think it's the best thing as far as a new media model. Is it 100% perfect? Certainly not. But it's, I think, a noble attempt at getting us back to what journalism's supposed to be. and your participation in that and support of the show is very meaningful. Again, leave that old stuff behind. They will not change as long as they have an audience. And with my producer, Brian Kruger, this is Rich Helppie signing off on the Common Bridge.
Thanks for joining us on the Common Bridge. Subscribe to the Common Bridge on Substack.com or use their Substack app, where you can find more interviews, columns, videos, and nonpartisan discussions of the day. Just search for the Common Bridge. You can also find the Common Bridge on Mission Control Radio on your Radio Garden app.